This is the Energy Manager's Playbook from Save on Energy, a podcast empowering Ontario energy managers to find success at work. I'm Jay Mullin.
Uncertainty and risk is pervasive in every investment. So to say that this investment has no risk or no uncertainty, that's just lying. We have to collect information. We have to perform due diligence. We have to then look at the pros and cons of each decision you make along the way.
Lee Hodgkinson is talking about a certain kind of uncertainty, a kind that I think most energy managers face on the job, that uncertainty around how we tackle the monumental task of electrifying our organizations. I get it. It can feel daunting. Some organizations become paralyzed, unable to commit to any meaningful goal. I've seen some companies spend a lot of money trying to eliminate uncertainty before making commitments or taking action. They rarely get a good return on that investment. So, in this episode, planning through uncertainty.
My name is Lee Hodgkinson, and I'm head of sustainability and technical services at Dream.
Dream, that's the company Lee works for, manages about $26 billion worth of real estate assets in various parts of the world. Their portfolio includes residential, industrial, and commercial buildings. And in 2022, the company committed to a net zero action plan that, in effect, reshapes how Dream does business. Now, commitments to decarbonization and electrification are baked right into decisions, including what buildings to invest in. And along with those decisions comes a lot of uncertainty, from how to hit those goals in a financially effective way to how a net zero plan affects how Lee, his colleagues, and his contractors must now work together, one building at a time. I was wondering if you could start off by helping to paint a picture of one of the buildings that has gone through this process with Dream.
Well, let's talk about 723 Bloor Street West. It's a 4-story residential building in Toronto. It has a charming facade that blends its historic architecture with that classic Toronto brick look. It houses 16 units on a busy commercial street. As with other 100-year-old buildings, the HVAC, the building envelope, the electrical systems were quite dated when we acquired the building. From the outside, it's typical to see open windows during the summer as the building did not have central cooling. And unfortunately, also open windows during the winter as the building didn't have great heating zone control. This is very typical for buildings of this vintage, but now inside the building, you'd find a modern, energy-efficient HVAC system that aligns perfectly with our sustainability targets.
And what about this building made it an interesting purchase for Dream to bring it into the portfolio?
Well, Dream is a leader in impact investing, whereby we target non-financial returns, such as creating a positive impact on the environment or creating a positive social impact on the tenants in the community at large, alongside our targeted financial returns. And we wanted to show that decarbonization of a historic building was possible. And this is not something that we've seen a lot of examples of in Toronto to date. But we were definitely drawn to how typical this type of building is. In Ontario, there are thousands of these pre-1960s low-rise apartment buildings just like this. So we felt that if we could crack this nut, then there would be an opportunity to repeat this playbook on other buildings.
So let's pull back for a second. This is an example of Dream's net zero action plan in action. Why did Dream see net zero as something worth pursuing in the first place?
Well, it was clear to us from the investment community as well as from the direction of government that real estate, which is responsible for 30 to 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions in whether that's Toronto or North America or even globally, buildings had to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And so we undertook an exercise to evaluate the costs and the scope of work required to decarbonize buildings and to set targets that we saw in the investment community and governments want to see in terms of net zero. And so our ambition is about creating sustainable, future-ready assets that stand out in the real estate market, reduces operational costs, attracts tenants and business partners, increases resiliency, and helps us secure attractive financing. So we definitely saw this as a business advantage for us.
It's not uncommon to see organizations work on these kinds of action plans or roadmaps and then struggle to commit when they don't know how they're going to achieve it. How did you get comfortable with that uncertainty?
Uncertainty and risk is pervasive in every investment. So to say that this investment has no risk or no uncertainty, that's just lying. We have to build up knowledge and expertise. We have to collect information. We have to perform due diligence. We feel that by building internal expertise, we can get more comfortable with that risk. We can have longer tail knowledge sharing. And we have to then do some very honest analysis and look at the pros and cons of each decision you make along the way. And then we have to execute those strategies to reduce that uncertainty and mitigate risk.
So in setting these targets and these plans, it's not about trying to eliminate that uncertainty. It's just learning how to manage that and work with it.
For sure. And another thing I'll just flag is building planning tools that let you forecast out this risk, let you quantify this risk, let you forecast out different scenarios and how that affects, okay, well, what does 10% decarbonization look like? What does 30% decarbonization look like? What are the timing implications? Could we do it this year, next year, or 10 years from now? Or do we need to do it this year? And then we work with experts to test and validate these tools and these assumptions. And over time, they challenge us to be better. That's the only way to explore new territory and growing.
So Dream now has these net zero action plans in place. They're approved, they're public. What are your next steps in terms of getting started, of following through, implementing those plans?
I think the biggest shift that we needed to do, and any company that goes on this journey has to do, is to change how it does its capital planning process. The way that we did it in the past, where we had a list of wants from the building. So that could be tenant wants, that could be building operator wants, and the list of needs at the building, which is, oh, there's a leaky roof. And let's just every year figure out how much money we can allocate towards those two things. And whatever we can't, we'll push out. That philosophy is not the most efficient way to go about planning decarbonization of a building. You really need to take a look at the long-term view, the 10, 15-year capital requirements of that building, and saying to yourself, what should I be doing first in this sequencing? And secondly, what projects are mutually exclusive or dependent on another project in terms of decarbonization? So an example of that is if you have 5 heating boilers at a building, if you only are planning to replace one in 2024 and then the other 4 in 2030, that would not be an efficient use of capital when you're looking at planning out the retrofits at that building. So we had to change that approach.
So it sounds like you're moving away from this sort of reactive approach to capital planning towards something that's more intentional. How do you go about changing that internal process?
I think we had to be honest with ourselves that reactive planning does lead to higher costs and missed opportunities. So in the traditional capital planning process, there's a building condition assessment that we hire an expert to do. We then validate A, the scope of work, B, the timing, and then C, the cost on that. But we had to change that process by actually incorporating an energy audit in that same report, basically, which is don't just tell us what the like for like option is, tell us what the other options are for this asset. Energy audits are not all created equal. If you get 10 people to do an energy audit, you'll get 10 different types of reports. If one person's stronger on mechanical versus another person who's stronger on solar, they're going to give you very different reports. So we had to hone in on an energy audit scope of work that was conducive towards what we were planning to do with these assets. And so that was often a little bit more complicated retrofits than just, okay, well, we're going to replace this light bulb with another light bulb. Sometimes you actually had to say, okay, how many lights do we need for this room? So change the question. And so we incorporated energy audits into our process, and we took a longer view on the capital requirements of the buildings. So instead of saying, well, how much am I spending next year? And now I'm spending double that. Say, how much am I spending over 10 years? And am I actually spending double that to get to net zero? And the answer is no. So in a single year, you might spend more, but we can completely show that over a 10-year or 20-year or longer horizon, we're actually spending less on our buildings from a capital and operations perspective. So that required involving the asset management team, involving the property management teams, involving our executives, all of who had great questions and great feedback. None of them said, why are we doing this, or this isn't doable. They all said, okay, well, if you want to do this, how are you going to tackle this challenge? And how are you going to mitigate this risk? And that made us all better.
Can you talk a little bit more about those different stakeholders that you had to bring in, both internal to the company and if there were any external, and what that engagement looks like?
From a capital planning perspective, we had a high level of engagement across the company already. So asset management, leasing, property management, what we call technical services and construction, all of these teams were already talking. However, we weren't trying to solve for the sustainability problem at the same time. We were just trying to solve for how do we operate excellent buildings, right? And so we added this new parameter. And so that involved including the sustainability team in the discussions where they previously had been limited. They weren't necessary for capital planning previously. And so changing this approach meant that we had to educate all of these other stakeholders on what getting to net zero and what decarbonization and what our sustainability goals means at the actual building level. That includes some building tours, but also that included just like hearing a lot of questions, having a lot of meetings.
And this sounds like a much more involved process than that old reactive approach to managing assets. Did this require changes within your team itself and how you approach this?
It definitely changed how we hire and changed the resources that we needed internally. We made the business case that we spend a lot of money on outside consultants who learn a lot about our buildings and then give us a report, and then we may never see those consultants again. And we didn't think that was the most conducive for long-term improvement or successful results. So we made the case to hire 2 energy managers internally. We even have a manager of smart building technologies and several other experts in-house that controls our external costs, as well as lets us learn about our buildings, lets us learn about what works and what the latest technology is, rather than just relying on somebody else telling you what's the best thing for your building. That is a different type of approach in the industry, but we believe that helps us move faster, helps us learn faster, and helps us control these risks and uncertainty that we talked about before.
What is some of the type of work or the type of tools or analysis that they do that helps be more agile? Like you said, you're bringing that capacity in-house.
Yeah, as funny as it sounds, we really don't trust what other people's financial analysis about our buildings tells us. So I think everybody listening can relate to, here's a proposal with a 5-year payback, everybody should go do it. You've probably got a lot of assumptions behind that payback analysis, which is, well, is there an escalation to utility costs? Is there a discount rate? Is there an interest rate? There's a whole bunch of these inputs that probably we're going to be more knowledgeable about on our own buildings than in some outside engineer or consultant. So firstly, it was working really closely with our asset management team to model out the financial implications of a lot of these types of proposals and initiatives. And they got it. As soon as we kind of started explaining, they were very adaptable to, okay, we understand how to spend money to make money. Show us how this money being spent makes us money. And so we internalized a lot of that financial analysis. The other thing I would just flag is when you're doing a design, you're iterating on very small things and wondering what the impact of that is. And one of the best tools for that is an energy model. And so what we kind of standardized on is whenever we hire someone to do an energy audit or a decarbonization roadmap, we want them to also develop an energy model for that building and then show us the roadmap on that actual energy model. Then we can have this living, breathing, adaptable thing that we can use year over year rather than a report just sitting on a shelf.
So you end up with this digital twin of the building that you can play with and try different scenarios with?
Yeah, exactly. And it's limited in its abilities. There's a lot of different levels to digital twins, but we definitely felt that when we're hiring an engineer to tell us something about how much energy a heat pump would save in our building or something like that, they're essentially building an energy model, whether they tell you or not. So why wouldn't we want a copy of that? And further, why wouldn't we actually force them to do a really good job on that model? Rather than, I'll admit it, I'm a recovering engineer. I used a lot of spreadsheets to do energy modeling back in the day, and it worked for then, but I think we have better tools now. So why not spend a little bit more upfront, get a really good energy model, and then we can give that to all the engineers that we work with over the next 5 years at that building to say, hey, that thing that you said you want to do with this building, plug it into the energy model and actually tell us what those results would be rather than just using your own assumptions and your own inputs to come up with an output.
You've developed this new approach to planning, this more intentional, proactive approach. Let's go back to that multifamily building in Toronto you were talking about. How did you apply this approach, roll up the sleeves, get into that transformation of that building in particular? What did it look like?
Yeah, so let's go to step 0. Whenever you buy a building, you have to collect data and figure out what makes the building tick. That exercise showed us that the infrastructure was aging at this building, but it also showed us what could be reused, such as the windows and roof, and what infrastructure could not, such as the in-suite electrical panels, the main electrical service panels. That baseline exercise showed us, okay, we're going to be challenged on power. We're going to be challenged with these aging infrastructures. So we calculated the total power required if we electrified everything in the building using typical energy efficiency projects. So in this building, that meant electrifying not just the heating system, but also the domestic hot water and the gas-powered clothes dryers. When we totaled up all of the power requirements to decarbonize this building and went to Toronto Hydro to get it, we found the cost and the timeline to be prohibitive. So we had to look at reducing redundancy as well as focusing on higher efficiency equipment. And so what I mean by this is just because you have two systems that can run at the same time doesn't mean they ever will. So we can use an engineered diversity factor to design the peak systems so that realistically they only ever draw 80% of that full load rating. And of course, higher efficiency products require less power capacity in the first place.
And what about, like you mentioned, with that proactive approach to planning, there's, this sequencing of what should be done, when do we wait till end of life of certain equipment? How did that play into this building?
So we identified that, the boilers for heating, as well as even the domestic hot water boilers and some other systems were near end of life. We actually didn't feel a strong need to rip out all of the existing heating infrastructure that was already there. So instead, we installed the heat pump system to replace it, but we left the other stuff in place. This actually gave us a bit of runway to do some testing on the heat pump system before fully decommissioning the boilers. I think that was quite novel. I think a lot of people get very focused on either one or the other, or leaving both in place for an indefinite period of time, whereas we kind of looked at this as more of a phase-out type of approach of, all right, we want to learn a lot about how this building works really well, and having a safety net wouldn't be a bad thing. But in the end, we won't need the boiler system. So instead, our approach was to install fully standalone heat pumps. So in every bedroom and every room, this gives tenants fully individualized heating and cooling abilities, and it also gives them control of their own carbon footprints.
And what kind of results have you seen from it?
The system went live in November. And so far, the system is performing as expected. We still have some work to do at this building, such as electrification of the domestic hot water system, as well as some plumbing upgrades as well. But all in, we're targeting a 75% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and an overall energy reduction of 56%.
So that's just one building story. How many buildings have you adapted so far?
We have 5 or 6 other buildings that are in the planning stage, and we have 2 other buildings that are in the actual retrofit stage as well for similar types of projects right now. So the lessons that we learned at 723 Bloor have been invaluable to the success of these other projects that we're now executing on.
Great. Thank you for joining us today, Lee. I think this is a really great success story and really inspiring to hear the work that Dream's doing in this area.
Yeah, thanks so much.
What I really like about Lee's approach is how he accepts uncertainty as something that's inevitable, but he doesn't let it stop him. Instead, he focuses on a new approach to capital planning that would help manage risk while still moving forward. There isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all solution, but I think there are 2 key lessons from Dream's transition that stand out to me that show us how to move from a reactive planning process to a more proactive and intentional one. First, the building of internal capacity. Collecting more data on your buildings than usual, getting a better understanding of the existing equipment and capital plans, and using building models to test different scenarios, it's all incredibly helpful. It allowed Dream to figure out the right solutions and the right sequence of projects within a building, minimizing mistakes and maximizing impact. Second, the need for stronger engagement and coordination. Lee emphasized the importance of getting different departments, the energy or sustainability team, tenants, and even utilities on the same page. And that means listening to their questions, sharing knowledge, and learning from every step of the process. It's this kind of collaboration that makes ambitious goals like net zero feel achievable. My thanks to Lee Hodgkinson and Dream. Now, let me know what you're enjoying about the show. I'd love to hear more about what challenges you're facing at work and what victories you've celebrated in your own energy management career. Send me an email by finding the link in the show notes to this episode. You'll also find a link to the Save on Energy website, where you can learn how to improve your energy management practices. I'm Jay Mullin, and this is the Energy Manager's Playbook, a podcast from Save on Energy.